Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Permission Granted, keeping files secure while still sharing data. Our presenter today will be Jeff Tatusco. We're very excited to have him. If you guys have any questions or anything for Jeff during this webinar, you're more than welcome to comment anything down in the comment box below. And I'm going to turn the time over to Jeff now.
All right, thank you very much, Emmeline. Anyway, I would like to welcome everybody to the session. As she said, my name is Jeff Tatusco. I am a hybrid trainer here with New Horizons Computer Learning Center. And today we are going to spend some time talking a little bit about the ability to go in and, share files and be able to make sure that the files are going to be secure, but getting people to go ahead and access them in a variety of different ways. So we're going to kind of go through, give you some opportunities to see how all of that's going to work. Before I get started, a little bit of information about myself. Like I said, my name is Jeff Tatusco. Actually, I'm now a hybrid trainer here with New Horizons. I am based here in Pittsburgh, so a warm welcome from the Steel City. Warm being kind of a relative term. It is 33 degrees and cloudy right now, but we'll take it. I'm not going to argue too much. A lot of times when people come into these sessions, they like to know that the instructor has some idea what he's talking about. You can see a listing of different certifications that I hold through there through Microsoft. Again, take that for what it's worth. The powers that be like me to let you know that I'm a 4-time top 20 worldwide instructor in the New Horizons Network. You can take that for what it's worth. In case you're wondering about my overall mindset, yes, I am a huge fan of the Muppets. However, I am much more of a classicist. I much prefer the original version rather than the version that just came out a few years ago. But, to each their own. Okay. So what exactly are we going to be talking about today? The first thing we want to do is I'm just going to go ahead and kind of give you a quick history on how people have gone in and gotten files and shared files with other people. We're going to talk a little bit about how how you can go in and be able to share information out, what had been done, different ways to be able to do it, give you some opportunities to see that. We'll talk a little bit about the concept of using SharePoint and Teams. Again, they are very, very similar. They're both related to a concept called collaboration technology. We'll give you some idea as to why you might want to use one or the other, depending upon what your needs are and how that's all going to work. We're also going to spend some time talking a little bit about the concept of sharing files. It's a little bit different from simply going out and using files and sending them to other people or putting them into a file share. We'll talk a little bit about using some of those different options. We're going to spend a good bit of time talking a little bit about SharePoint as well, and really digging into some of the different types of permission levels that are already built in. We're going to give you some ideas as to how that's going to work and how you're going to be able to use them to make sure that everything is going to work properly and make sure that people are going to be able to do the right kinds of things. One of the biggest things that you're going to want to realize inside of SharePoint is that you're going to want to make sure that you're giving people and setting them up in groups so that you don't have to handle individual permissions on a regular basis. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the different groups that are there. We'll talk also about the ability to go in and create new groups to make sure you're able to see some of that information. We're also going to spend a little bit of time, again, talking about how people are going to be able to access different items and what's going to happen when permissions change and when people are going to be able to access those items. So we'll talk a little bit about what's called the access control list, the ACL, give you some ideas as to how that's all going to work. We're going to finish the day by talking a little bit, or at least the session, talking a little bit about creating your own permissions. This is something that's kind of come about a little bit more frequently with SharePoint Online. Many people now have more options to be able to go in and do their own kind of thing. So we'll give you some ideas as to how that's going to work and be able to see exactly what's going on. And then what I'll do then is I will just go ahead and open up the floor to questions at the end of the session. So we'll just kind of go there and see what happens. So let's go ahead and get started here and see what kind of trouble we can get into. As I mentioned, the first thing that I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about how you're able to go in, or what was happening, being able to get files out to other people. Before cloud storage was readily available, people had really one of two ways where they could go in and allow access to a file. First of all, they could go in and they could email the file to somebody. Okay, that's fine. The other thing that they could do is they could put the file into a file server that was housed in their own or on their premises. So you could go in, you could access all of that information and do it. The problems with both of those were many. First of all, if you email a file to somebody, as I'm sure you realize, what you're ending up doing is you're basically taking a copy of that file and you're sending it off to somebody else. Now you have two competing copies of the file. If you make a change, that person's not going to know about it. If they make a change, you're not going to know about it. So it really didn't necessarily help to have everybody on the same page if everybody was able to make their own changes without really being able to see them. If you put the file in a file share, you could go in and yes, you could make it so that people could access it. There were problems with that. First of all, if you wanted other people outside of your company to be able to do something like that, or they wouldn't be able to access it, they would have no way to access that file. The other thing that you had to think about with this is the fact that really the permissions were really handled by IT. You don't want to go into Windows servers and trying to handle different read and write permissions and going in and allowing and denying different things. It got to be a real pain. So there weren't necessarily the easiest way where you could go in and simply access that information and make it accessible to a lot of different people. So finally, back in 2002, Microsoft released its first version of this program called SharePoint. And what it did was it allowed people to go in and have access to a lot of different files and have a lot of different ways to be able to pull that information up. So now you could go in via some kind of web browser and you'd be able to access your files. You weren't really tied down to your own computer. Now, obviously, there were a lot of restrictions to it. You couldn't do absolutely everything that you needed to, but it did give you some opportunities to go ahead and make sure that multiple people could access a file on a regular basis. Later on, Microsoft said, it's nice that people can go in and have this cloud storage, but it's really kind of geared toward companies. Well, then starting in Office or with 2007, they came up with this program that was called SkyDrive. It's now referred to as OneDrive. And it was basically personal cloud storage where anybody could go in as long as you had a Microsoft account and be able to store all kinds of different files up in the cloud. So you had the opportunity to go ahead and work with this and be able to make sure that you could go ahead and share that out with a variety of different people. You didn't have to just say, okay, I'm going to restrict this to a certain area or a certain limit of people. Again, because it was personal cloud storage though, the only person by default that can access anything in OneDrive is you. And that is true up to this day. So as you go through and you upload files into your OneDrive account, that means that by default, you're the only one that can see them. You do have the opportunity to go ahead and share them with other people to make sure that they can go ahead and access them as well. The other main driver or invention that they came up with along these lines happened about 5 years ago with the introduction of Microsoft Teams. Now, Microsoft Teams, once again, gave you the opportunity to do a lot of the same thing. You could go ahead and you could share files out, you could store files in a cloud-based location, but it gave you some different opportunities to do other things as well. For example, one of the things that they wanted you to be able to do was be able to communicate with people. One of the things that I kind of mentioned before was that concept of collaboration technology. Collaboration technology is Microsoft's way of saying a way to share information and also to communicate in order to achieve a common goal. Well, if you think about it, SharePoint and Teams both meet those definitions. The Teams aspect is going to give a little bit more, though, in the way of communication tools. So you're going to be able to go ahead and incorporate a lot of different options to be able to see that. So it kind of begs the question, what is Teams? Why are we going to go ahead and use this? And why would we want to use that as opposed to SharePoint? Well, as I mentioned, this is kind of the next step. I don't know if you want to call it an evolutionary step in the way of collaborating with people, but it's definitely going to be something very, very similar to what you would be able to go ahead and use with SharePoint. If you think about it, you have files that you're going to be able to go ahead and store in there, and you can go ahead and communicate with different people. It really does make it a whole lot easier in order to work with this. Because it has those file sharing capabilities, most people say, well, I do that in SharePoint anyway. Why use Teams? Well, Teams, as I mentioned, is kind of geared a little bit more toward the communication aspect, where you can go in and you can have direct messaging using chat, or you can have conversation using the posts pane, and you can hold meetings. You can do those types of options and be able to work with them. But you have those file sharing capabilities where you would be able to go ahead and incorporate all these different types of options and be able to see that. Now, once again, some of the other things like the file sharing and the ability to go ahead and store the information, that sounds an awful lot like SharePoint. And again, it really is, because what ends up happening is when you create a team, in the background, Microsoft creates a SharePoint site for you, or at least Microsoft 365 does. So when you go in and you create a team, there's a SharePoint site that automatically gets created. Now, just simply going in there, most people don't really think about that SharePoint site. You can always access it pretty much any time that you need to, whether you want to go in through the SharePoint site, or whether you want to go through Teams, or if you want to go through Microsoft 365's homepage, navigate to SharePoint, and you could put the URL in. It gives you access to that site, but all the files are going to be associated with this. So when you go in there, when you create a team, every team is broken down into subsections referred to as channels. And basically what that does is it allows you to go ahead and organize all of the information inside of Teams. So when you do something like this, if you create a team in Microsoft Teams, like I said, that creates a SharePoint site. Every SharePoint site comes with a library called documents. It's actually referred to as shared documents, but it's really documents. Now, inside of that documents library, you will see a folder called General that ties in with the name of the channel that's associated and created with each team. Every team has a channel called General. So that basically means that if you go in and you create more channels inside of SharePoint, what's going to end up happening is you will get new folders inside of that documents library. So that means you can go in there, you can store all of your information. It's all being stored really in a SharePoint library. So when you store a file in Teams, that's what's happening. It's storing it in SharePoint so that you can access it in either one of those places. And it makes it really easy to go ahead and pull that information in. Now, that kind of begs the question, well, okay, if we create a team and it creates a SharePoint site, does it work in the reverse? It doesn't do so automatically. However, if you create a SharePoint site, you can then create a team that makes it a little bit easier to go in there and pull that information up. Let me go ahead and show you what I mean here. So for example, and I'm not going to go ahead and create anything like this, but what I have here is just a generic team. It's called HR Team Site, and it has two channels with it, the General channel and the Employees channel. If you look at this information, it shows you a variety of different files that might be listed in here that I can go ahead and access. Now, if I switch back over to SharePoint, this team was actually created by using a SharePoint site. So now I have all of this information, and if I come in here under the HR Team Documents, which is basically one that I just renamed, I'll be able to go in here and find that. And if you look really closely, down below here, yes, you have the General channel, which I have a folder associated with that. And then I'll also have a folder related to the Employees channel. So each one of those has the opportunity to go ahead and store that information and make sure you can go ahead and keep everything basically the same. So you have the opportunity to make sure you can go ahead and store your data in a place where it's going to be available to anybody that needs it, but it's going to be secure from those people that don't have access to it. So we're going to be able to kind of go ahead and make sure we have the ability to go ahead and access all of the information that's going to be necessary there. So again, if you think about it, we talked about the concept of being able to go in and store files online, but it still didn't necessarily allow everybody to simply go in and just say, okay, I'm going to open this file and I'm going to open this file. When you go in and you want to be able to access their different files, they may need to make sure that other people can go ahead and see them. So if you think about the way that is going to happen inside of OneDrive and inside of Microsoft Teams, the option that you have to get people to see the files is to be able to go in there and share the files. Okay. So if you want to be able to take these files and send them to other people, what you do is you basically share those files associated with it. Now, in SharePoint, you can basically do the same thing. And actually with Teams, you can go ahead and work with this as well, in the sense that if you store a file there, everybody that has access to that team or to the SharePoint site, they now have automatic access to that library by default. Obviously, that can change. You can go in, you can store the files, be able to access all of that information to make sure you're able to see everything that's going on. One of the nice things about this is the fact that it's going to allow you to give a little bit more control to the users. You don't have to rely on your IT department in order for things to get done. So you don't have to worry about saying, okay, I want to be able to give this file or allow somebody to access this file. I don't have to send a ticket through to my IT department to make sure that they're going to access everything. Likewise, you don't even have to contact the person that's responsible for your site. That might not be somebody in IT, but you have the ability to go ahead and click a button and then share that information out. Now, just because you have the ability to go ahead and share a file with people, you have to realize that it's not necessarily just going to be something where you're going to go ahead and automatically send it out to absolutely everybody in your group. Okay. What you're going to be able to do is you can set different permission levels that are going to be associated with this. So you'll have the opportunity to say, okay, yes, I want to be able to go ahead and restrict this so that only certain people are going to be able to access it. And I want to be able to say, okay, yes, they can access it, but I don't want them to edit it. I only want them to read it. Or maybe I even want them to review it, so they can suggest changes to me. That's actually a newer change that's come out recently. Okay. This sharing permission can be restricted by site owners. So if a site owner realizes that there's a lot of information in there that doesn't need to necessarily go out and they want to restrict people from sharing those files, site owners do have the capability to make a setting change so that it's automatic, any of those are going to come through. And I'll show you that here in a few minutes. But what we'll be able to do is you'll be able to see how that's going to work. So if you decide that you want to go ahead and share a file, what you're going to do when you click on the share button, you're going to see a screen that looks something like this. The first thing you're going to see is a link up the top that may say one of those 4 options at the top here. Again, that's going to be a default setting that'll be turned on by your company. You'll see that it's actually grayed out on this example where it says anyone with the link. Anyone with the link basically means that you can go ahead and forward that to anybody inside or outside of the company. Some companies allow outside access to files, some companies don't. Just kind of depends on what you're looking for. So in that case, you could go ahead and share that with anybody. The default associated with this one anyway is the ability to share it with people inside of New Horizons. Now, you want to be careful with that because you'll see that it does give you the opportunity to just go ahead and forward it or link or send that link to people. Having said that, if they decide that somebody else in the company may want to be able to see that file as well, they could forward that link and that link would automatically be available for somebody else within the company. Okay. So just again, you have some different options there. You could also just simply choose people with existing access, and then you could change the permissions that you have, or you have an option to specifically share it just with specific people. And I'm going to be honest with you, that's probably going to be a best practice for you because you don't simply want to go in and say, okay, I'm going to go ahead and just share it with whomever, and they can go ahead and share it out on their own. You choose specific people, give them the option. Then even if they forward that on to somebody else, somebody else tries to open that link, they're going to get a message that says, sorry, you don't have access to this file. So again, just something to kind of keep in mind. Now, the other thing that's going to be associated with that, once you make that choice, you're going to see that you have the ability to restrict exactly what people can do. By default, if you want to be able to go ahead and allow them to edit it, sure, you can go ahead and edit it. You can simply click the little pencil button over on the right side there. I mentioned a minute ago that new option that's now available that says can review. And really all that does is it allows people to go in and suggest changes. So it doesn't really make the changes in the file. It just kind of marks them inside of the file. And then it comes back to you and you can say, oh, yes, okay, that makes sense. We can go ahead and make that change. Or you can say, no, that doesn't make any sense. We're going to go ahead and get rid of it. So there's different options you can go ahead and incorporate. Or the other option is you can simply make it read only, and that way you can simply go in there and make sure that all they can do is look at the file. They can't really do anything with it. They're only going to be able to read it and be able to use that information. So once again, there's a lot of different tools that you can go ahead and incorporate to be able to set this up. Now, when you're sharing those files, whether it is in Teams, whether it's in SharePoint, whether it's in OneDrive, that's the kind of option that you're going to have when a user decides to go ahead and share the file with somebody else, okay? So you have the opportunity to kind of go in there and work with that information. Now, having said that, I mentioned a little bit ago that you have the ability, especially inside of SharePoint, to be able to go in and maybe be a little bit more restrictive. Okay, so what you want to be able to go ahead and do is make sure that all of your information is going to be available, but only to the people that really access it. Okay, when you start going into SharePoint, okay, you don't necessarily have to worry about a lot of different changes that are going to take place. I mentioned a little bit ago that once you upload a file into a SharePoint library, by default, anybody that has access to that library automatically gets access to that file. And that's basically the case as it goes through. Now, if you're working in SharePoint Online, or if you're even working with an older version like SharePoint 2016 or even SharePoint 2013 or older versions than that, there's a main concept that's associated with permissions that makes things a little bit easier. Okay, because what's going to happen is, like I said, you don't have to do anything to make sure that your files are going to stay safe. There's a feature that is associated with SharePoint called security trimming. Okay, security trimming is oftentimes referred to as permission-based sharing. Okay? In other words, it allows people to go in and make sure that all of their information is going to be secure by basically hiding it from the people that can't access it. So therefore, one person in your department may log in, they may open something up and say, oh, okay, here's this file. Their coworker may log into the exact same location and look at something and say, hey, where's that file? I can't see it. That's the concept of security trimming. If you can see it, you have access to it. If you can't, then you don't. Even if you try and go ahead and search for information, it very well may not show up inside of those search results when you try and perform them. So it does make it a whole lot easier. You don't have to worry about doing a lot of things to go ahead and make sure that everything is going to be up and running and be set up here. Now, when you go into SharePoint, by default, permissions are inherited. Now, what ends up happening is, especially if you start looking at a site level, okay? Remember, SharePoint is really at its heart a website. So you're going in and you're accessing all this information. Now, if you consider the site as the top of the hierarchy, just as an example, what that means is that all of the options and all of the settings that are associated with that site filter down to all of the components on that site. That means that, again, you go from the site to the app. And when I say an app, I'm talking about lists, which are basically kind of like online spreadsheets where you can store information, or libraries where you can go ahead and store files. You can create folders in each of those, and each one of those can house either individual items, or you can store documents in them. So if you've ever gone into a file share and you open something up and you open up a folder, what do you see? More folders. You open one of those folders, what do you see? More folders, and so on and so on and so forth. So again, what ends up happening is the permissions that are associated with the site filter down to the libraries or lists, they filter down to the any folders that might be created, and then they filter down into those different documents. So if somebody has permission to access information on one level, that means they have access to information on all of the different levels. Again, that's by default. You can go in there, you can get all that information basically set up. So they all retain the same access levels that you can go in, you can create to make sure that all that information is going to be set up properly. So once again, you have opportunities to kind of go in there, store your information, and it's going to be secure because you don't have to worry about outside eyes or prying eyes getting in to be able to see anything. Okay. Now, inside of SharePoint, you have the ability to go in and create permission levels. Now, before you simply go in and say, okay, I'm going to recreate the wheel and start creating all kinds of different permissions, you don't really have to do that because SharePoint has a listing of different permission levels that are going to be associated with these. Now, these permission levels are going to be created by default. And it basically means that if you have this permission level, these are some of the things that you're going to be able to go ahead and do. Now, some of these, again, we're going to kind of start from the bottom, in other words, the most restrictive, and work our way up. So the first permission level that's available inside of a SharePoint site is going to be what's called restricted read. And as the name suggests, there's really not a lot you can do with it. You can read files or you can read items, and that's it. You can go in there, you can look at it, and you can't really do anything else. You can look at pages, you can look at the list items, you can look at the documents. One of the key things that you are going to realize, though, is the fact that you cannot download any of those. So once again, being restricted like that, you're not going to be able to go in and do anything along those lines. Then you take one step up to what's called the read permission level. Now, read, again, gives you the opportunity to have what's called a read-only permission. That means that people can go in, they can open files, they can open content, they can read it, they can download files for future use. But honestly, they're not going to be able to do much more than that. They can't simply go in and upload content. They're not going to be able to do much in that regard. The next permission level above that is what's referred to as a contribute permission. Now, this is going to be a permission level that's going to be a lot more inclusive. It's going to give people more opportunity to do different things. So you'll be able to go in, obviously you have the same permissions that you have with the restricted read and read permission levels, but then you also have the ability to go in and add, modify, and delete items and or documents inside of those lists and libraries. Again, you have the ability to kind of go in there and incorporate all of that information and do what you need to. Now, one step above that is what's referred to as the edit permission. Okay? Now, the edit permission, again, has all those same permissions of the contribute permission. But the edit permission also allows people to go in and add, modify, and delete or manage entire lists or libraries. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this here in a minute, but one of the things that you're going to want to kind of keep in the back of your mind is the fact that by default, most people that go into a site, into a SharePoint site, by default are part of a group that have that edit permission. I'm not quite sure why Microsoft thinks that's a great idea. That's not up to me, but you may see there might be some options where you're going to be able to change that. One step above the edit permission level is design. Now, once again, you have all those same kinds of options that you have with the edit permission, but it also allows you to go in and approve content. So if you wanted to make sure that rather than just simply uploading files and allowing everybody to see them, you can put them out for approval so that somebody actually has to approve the content before you can go in and actually access it. So you can go ahead and decide to pull that information in and be able to see that data there. You'll also have the ability under the design permission to go in and customize the site. That means you can kind of change the look and the feel of the site to be able to work with that. The other permission level is going to be what's called full control, which, as the name suggests, really means that you have full control over the site, where you're going to be able to go in and not only do all of that, but also manage permissions for people and groups on the site. Okay. Now, those are already built into the site, but that doesn't mean that that's the only thing that's going to be available. You have the ability to simply go in and create multiple permission levels. That way you can go in and you can be able to set that up. Now, I will say that if you're working in SharePoint Online, as a site owner, you would be able to go in there and do something like this. Okay. If you're working in an older version of SharePoint, like 2016 or 2013 or something along those lines, typically that is what's referred to as that's an option that's available at the top level site only. So I'll talk about that a little bit more here at the end, but that's an option that you're going to have available to be able to set this up. Now, I want you to think about something. I want you to think about the number of people that your company employs. Okay, maybe it's dozens, maybe it's hundreds, it might even be thousands of people. Now, think about what it would be like for you to have to handle the permissions for each and every employee on your site. That's not something that you're going to want to do. It would probably end up being a really, really busy job. It would probably be a 24/7 type of job to kind of keep track of everything that's going on. So we need to have some kind of way to make it a little bit easier to be able to go ahead and use this. And what SharePoint does is it gives you the opportunity to put people into groups as opposed to just simply applying permissions to them. So what you can do is you can use these security groups to be able to go ahead and access the information and be able to give permission levels to those specific groups. Therefore, once you add somebody into the group, they automatically attain that permission level for that specific area where you do that. Okay. Now, I do want you to understand that this is slightly different from what that concept of Microsoft 365 groups. Okay. So every time a SharePoint site is created or a team is created, in the background, Microsoft a 365 group is created. So you get, like I said, you have access to the SharePoint site. You can also have access to a calendar that's associated with that. A plan from Microsoft Planner would go along with those as well. So that's something a little bit different from what we're really talking about here. These security groups, what we're talking about, allow you to store this information inside of SharePoint so that you can make sure that people are going to access the right kind of information. Now, by default, every SharePoint site automatically has 3 groups set up for you. Okay. The first one is going to be your visitors group. Now, the visitors group, like I said, they already have permission levels associated with them. So the visitors group automatically has that read permission set up for them. People can go in, they can read content, they can open it, they can download it, and that's really about it. Most of the people that are going to be working in a SharePoint site are going to be part of the members group. The members group are going to have the edit permission. Again, this is going to be the most widely used. It's going to be for everyday users. So they'll have all the permissions like from the read level, but then they can also go in, they can add, modify, delete content. They can also manage lists. And once again, I'm not quite sure about that. I don't know why that's such a good idea, because to me, that sounds like, suddenly somebody that's having a bad day can simply go in there and delete an entire library, which again, it can be retrieved obviously, but just something to kind of keep in mind. Though, again, you can go ahead and set that up. The other group that's going to be available with that is going to be the owners group. Okay? The owners group, as you might think, has the full control permission. So they can do pretty much everything on the site that is going to be available. They can get everything set up there and be able to use what they need to. Now, as I mentioned before, I talked about the permission levels that you can go ahead and create, but additionally, you can go in, you can also create individual groups to be able to see exactly what's going on. so that if you don't necessarily like the permission level that's associated with one of these, you could create a new group and apply a permission level to that as well. So it makes it a little bit easier to go ahead and control exactly what you need by being able to give a little bit more opportunity to see things. Now, one thing I do want to go ahead and alert you to, okay? When you start working with these different groups, as you start adding people into these groups, you're going to realize you don't have to add individuals, right? If you have Active Directory that is going to be set up in your system, Active Directory has a lot of distribution groups associated. So rather than having to type in each individual's name, if they have these, or if you have these distribution groups set up in Active Directory, you can put those in, and then everybody that is a part of that distribution group automatically becomes a part of this SharePoint group, and thereby they now have the ability to access the information based off of the permission level associated with that. Here's the rub with that. If you go in there, you're going to realize that there are going to be people that are going to be part of multiple distribution groups as you go in and work with them, okay? So let's say, for example, that you add somebody into the members group. So you add one distribution group into the members group here. You add another person into another group into the visitors group here. Okay, now you have one person that is a member of both of those distribution groups. So what's going to be the result? In SharePoint, the least restrictive permission that a person has becomes their effective permission. In other words, if you have somebody that, even if they're listed in the owners group, and then they're also listed as part of the visitors group, the least restrictive means that they have all of the permissions of the owners group. So you do have to kind of keep track of what people can access, what they can do, and be able to see everything that's going to be able to go on there. Okay. Again, another one of those best practices to kind of go ahead and think about, make sure you add people into groups rather than simply providing individual permission. If somebody says, hey, I want to be able to go ahead and access this information, if you simply say, all right, I'm going to go ahead and add you, I'll give you the the edit permission. Okay, that's great. But if you think about it, if you have to do that for everybody, first of all, it's going to get really, really old really, really quickly trying to add them all in. But also it's going to be really hard to kind of keep track of who has access to what. So it's going to be a lot easier for you to simply go in and add people into groups rather than doing something like this. And SharePoint makes this really easy. If you go up to the very top right of your screen inside of SharePoint, there's going to be a little settings gear up there. When you click on that settings gear, you can come down and see site permissions. And when you click site permissions, this is the screen that you're going to see. Again, you can see that you can add people into the site owners group, site members group, the site visitors group, and all you have to do to open those up, you can simply add members, pick the group that you want them in, and now they're going to automatically have that permission level that's associated with that group. So you have a lot of different opportunities to be able to make sure you can go ahead and see that. Let me show you this again here really, really quickly. If I go, that's actually not what I wanted. There we go. If I open this up, I'm on my SharePoint team site here. If I come up to the very top right, I can click on the settings gear. Under my settings gear, I come down and choose site permissions. If I choose site permissions, now, again, I want to be able to go ahead and I can see exactly who is in what group. The site member, site visitors, I have nobody in the site owners group. If I decide that I want to add a member, I can simply add member. And then I can go ahead and click on whomever I want to. Now, I have obviously pretty much everybody that I need to in here. But if I simply go up and click add members, now I could go ahead and type in, oh, I don't know, user 09 or something along those lines. When I do that, the next thing it's going to do is, okay, well, how do you want to do this? If I click this drop down, I can either add them as a member or I can add them as an owner because they're already in there as a member anyway. So I can go ahead and incorporate those different options there. So that's a quick, easy way where you can go in and you can handle the different permission levels to be able to see everything that's going on and be able to use all the data that's going to be necessary there. Okay. So the next thing that a lot of people are going to ask is, I mentioned before that if you want to be able to go in and take those permissions, they're already going to be inherited. But if you think about it, every single item that's going to be associated with this SharePoint site has the ability to kind of keep track of everything that's going on. So for example, every time somebody accesses something or changes a permission level, what you have is what's referred to as an access control list. So all that is just going to be a log that's going to keep track of all the different permissions that are associated with the site and all the different changes that are being performed there. So you can go in, you can access all of that information, be able to see it. Now, this isn't something you're going to do on a regular basis, but it does kind of keep track of everything to be able to pull that up. Now, that means that permissions can be changed on sites, apps, folders, or you can also create them on items and documents. Now, two things I want to kind of keep track of with this. The first one I'm going to talk about very, very briefly is the fact that on the site level, you're probably not, that's going to depend more on what version of SharePoint you're using. Okay. If you're using SharePoint 2016 or earlier than that, then yes, you can change permissions at the site level. If you're working in SharePoint Online, you're not going to really do that as much because the hierarchy is not still there. Again, I'll talk about that here in a little bit later on. The other thing that I want to go ahead and kind of point out to you is if you're looking with some of this information and you want to be able to go ahead and see exactly what's going on there, you can share out, or I'm sorry, you can change permission levels on individual items or on individual documents. That is really not a good idea, though. Best practice is to make sure that you don't do that and create individual permissions on that level. Why? Because if you think about it, it's kind of like adding individuals into your site. You think about how many people you have. I talked about that earlier. If you start adding individual permissions on document levels, then what ends up happening is it's going to be impossible to kind of keep track as to who has access to what, to be able to see exactly who can do what on individual documents. And somebody eventually at some point along the line is going to say, hey, I can't access this document that I really need access to because somebody hid it and they can't be able to do anything with it anymore. So it's just something to kind of keep in mind to be able to work with those. Okay. Now, as I mentioned, inheritance can be broken at every level. That means you can create unique permissions on any one of those levels, be it the site, be it the app, list or library, a folder, or again, the document or item and that sort of thing. Okay. So if you're at the site level, once again, we'll talk about that here in a second. You could do certain things. If you're at the list or library level, the process that you're going to follow, you'll basically open up the app. You'll go to your settings gear, go to list or library, more library settings, and then you'll click permissions for this document library. I'll show you that here in a second. If you're working on a folder, okay, you can go in, basically you click the checkbox next to the folder, and you'll notice that there's going to be 3 vertical dots that are going to show up there. When you click those 3 vertical dots, it's going to automatically open up a window that says, or a menu item that shows you a variety of options. You can click Manage Access. Now, the Manage Access window pops up there, and you'll see all those different options that are available. But then down at the bottom right, you'll see Advanced, and it's going to show you a very similar screen to be able to see that. Okay, let me show you what I mean. If I go in here and I pull this up, let's say that I want to go in and I have this HR Team Pictures library. It's basically a different type of library that's associated with a SharePoint site. If I come in here and I want to change the permissions associated with this, what I'll do is I'll come up to my settings gear. Under my settings gear, I'm going to come down and choose library settings. Now, when I do that, it basically brings up a new pane over here on the right-hand side. By the way, if you're working in SharePoint 2016 or earlier than this pane won't show up. You'll just go directly to the next step. Okay, so you can go in here, you can access that information. So if I click more library settings, this is basically what it's going to look like if you open something like that up. Now, over here in the middle under the permissions and management group, you'll see the second link down says permissions for this library. And if I click that link, now you'll look up at the top of the screen here and you see that I have an option that says stop inheriting permissions. If I were to go ahead and click that, first of all, SharePoint's going to give you a warning. A little message says, hey, if you do this, any of the changes that are made at the top level or at the site level aren't going to affect this library anymore. So now you can go in and you can change that information around. So if I simply click OK, what it's now going to do is it's going to go in here and say, okay, I can go in and use these different options and be able to see these. Now, all I can do really in this case is, let's say that I want to change the permission level, okay? Or maybe I don't want any visitors to be able to access anything in here. What I can do is if I want to edit the permission level, I can simply click the checkbox next to the team name. So let's say I'm going to choose members and I want to give them that edit permission, or I'm sorry, the contribute permission as opposed to the edit permission. What I'll do is I'll click the checkbox. And now up at the top, you'll see a button up here that says edit user permissions. If I click that, now you can see that, yes, the edit permission is going to be associated with this. So if I uncheck edit and I check contribute, that'll be the active or the effective permission. Now, understand that you can have, these are checkboxes. They're not radio buttons. You can have multiple buttons checked. If you have multiple buttons checked, remember, the least restrictive permission is always going to win out. So just keep that in mind. But I'll stick with contribute here, and I'll click on OK. So now the members permission, and you'll be able to see this over here on the right-hand side. You can see exactly who has access to what. Now, if I decide, as I mentioned, that I don't want visitors to have any access to this library, then I can simply click the checkbox here, and then I can come up and click remove user permissions. Now, if I do that, again, it's going to say, you're going to remove this from this site or this library. Is that correct? You click OK. When you're removing permissions, please be careful that you don't remove your own permissions. That sounds laughable, but you will be surprised how often it happens. And if it does happen to you, unfortunately, your only solution is going to have to be a walk of shame down to the IT department and explain to them exactly why you can no longer access your own site. And unfortunately, I don't know if you know this or not, IT department tends to have a cruel sense of humor. They will probably laugh at you, right? So just be careful if you start removing permissions that you don't remove your own. Okay, but that's basically an option where you can go in and you can do that on the library level to be able to see that. Now, if I come into my team documents library again, okay, I can do the same thing if I want on the folder level. If I click the little icon next to the folder, again, come over, click on the three dots here, choose manage access. Under this window, if I come down and click advanced, it basically brings me to the exact same window, okay? So what this is doing, and it tells you right at the top, it tells you it's inheriting its permissions from the parent, which is the HR team documents library. If I were to go up and click stop inheriting permissions, I'd be able to see that information there and see what's going on. Again, the same thing holds true if you were to go into the documents library. I could do the same thing on a document, but it's really not a good idea because it gets really kind of crazy trying to keep track of everything in that regard. Now, having said that, I've kind of talked a little bit about, okay, the differences between using SharePoint Online and SharePoint 2016. And I said in SharePoint Online, you're not really going to create or break permissions at the site level. Why is that? Okay. With SharePoint 2016 and versions earlier than that, you have the ability to kind of create what's called more of a hierarchy, okay? At the top of each hierarchy, you have what's referred to as a top-level site. Now, the top-level site gives you all kinds of different options to be able to go in and access and do all kinds of different things on the site. Obviously, you can create permission levels, and that's where you would typically go in and create those different permission levels to see all of that information. Now, having said all of that, with SharePoint Online, that hierarchy really isn't kind of built out anymore. So with SharePoint 2016, you had a top level site, and then you had a bunch of sub-sites that might be created, and then sub-sites under those, and so on and so on and so forth. SharePoint Online now relies a little bit more on what's called a hub site, okay? And a hub site is more or less just a connector to a series of different sites that people can go into. So now you can easily connect and bounce back and forth between sites. You don't typically have a lot of sites and then sub-sites below them. The hub site, like I said, is a connector. It's not really a top-level site. It's more like a connector that shows all these different other sites that people can go in there and communicate with. Okay, so SharePoint Online, obviously, like I said, it's going to be organized a little bit differently. You don't have to really go in. So what ends up happening, I mentioned before with SharePoint 2016, you have that top level site. Everything was kind of grouped together in what's referred to as a site collection, where you would create all the different settings at the top level site of that site. I'm sorry, the top level site, and then all of that would automatically filter down. Well, here, because you have the hub site and all the sites are kind of built around that as opposed to being built off of it, it really means that every site that ends up being created off of a hub site automatically becomes its own site collection. That means that you can go in there, you can access a variety of different tools and be able to see a lot of different things in that regard. Okay, so just something to kind of keep in mind depending upon the version of SharePoint that you're using. So what else can you do at the quote unquote top level? In other words, the site level. If you go into your SharePoint site and from there you access site permissions, you can go in, you can see a variety of different options. So for example, you can go in, you can simply create a new SharePoint group. That means you can apply a permission level to that group. If you need to be able to see what kind of permission level an individual user has, you can simply click check permissions up at the top, and it will give you that opportunity to be able to see how that's going to work. Okay. Also, sometimes I mentioned that people aren't going to be able to see files, but if they happen to get a link to a file and they try and click on it, again, they might get a message that says, sorry, you don't have access to this. But one of the things that they can do is they can request access. So every site typically has at least one person that is associated with it where you can say, okay, this person's requesting access. You can either say, yes, you are allowed to have access, or no, go pound salt, you're not allowed. Those are some options that you have. Okay, so that's going to be available right from here. The other thing that you can go ahead and do is obviously you can add in other co-owners to make sure that you're not the only person that can handle permissions at this site. You can go in, you have the ability to access all of that data to be able to see what's going on. So, okay, now one other thing I want to go and show you, there is one other button that is active on this point. That's the button up at the top that says grant permissions. You're going to want to be careful using that, because if you go in and just simply say grant permissions, then that's the equivalent of giving individuals their own permission levels. And that's something you really want to try and avoid. So like I said, don't use grant permissions. So let me show you this exactly. And again, we're kind of running up out of time here, but I want to go ahead and show you this really quickly. If I come up here and I come down to site permissions. Now, I showed you this before, but there's a link here that says advanced permission settings. So now I have this different information that's going to be listed here. Up at the top, you'll see that there's an option up here that says create group. If I click that, what I can now do is I can go in and I can choose exactly what kind of permission level maybe a certain group of people are going to have. So I'll go ahead and call this approvers. Okay. Down below that, if I want to add an owner, by default, I'm creating the group. I'm the owner. You can add one name here. You can also add the name of a distribution group if you want to be able to put in multiple people. Unfortunately, you can't do both. You can't just add multiple names. You can either have a person's name or a distribution group. That's basically the way it is. Again, who can go ahead and view the membership? That's going to be basically the members. Who can edit it? Typically, that's going to be the owner of the group. So you can go in there, you can see that information. Down below, you can see that there's an option that says, do you want to allow requests to join or leave the group? Again, that's people basically requesting information or access to a specific group. If you answer yes to this, you'll see that there's going to be an option that will open up down below it that says, do you want to automatically accept those? I've yet to meet anybody that thinks that that's a great idea. But you can go in there, and if you answer, even if you answer no, the membership requests will automatically show up in that email address that's going to be listed. And then finally, the other thing that you can do is each group needs to have a permission level. Well, then you can simply go ahead and choose the permission level that you want to apply, and then simply click create. Now, once you do that, now I have this approvers group that's going to be associated with this. By default, I'm going to be a part of that group. So I can go in here and I can add people in. And again, if you notice, you can see new as one of your options. If I click new, now I can add in either names of distribution groups, or I can add in individual email addresses. This is still going to be preferable than just simply going in and adding unique individuals to be able to see all of that. So that's one of the options that's going to be available there that you can go ahead and work with. Okay. The other option that you do have, rather than just using those 6 permission levels, sometimes you run into a situation where you don't necessarily think that that's going to be exactly what you need. For example, maybe you run into a situation where people are, for whatever reason, getting rid of files that you don't want them to get rid of. Okay, and you're constantly having to go back in and fetch them and retrieve them and do what you need to. Well, one of the things that you can do is you can create your own unique permission levels that would be associated with all of these. Okay, now that's going to be that when you create a permission level, you're basically going to pick and choose from a total of 33 individual permissions that are associated with these. And again, these range anywhere from the ability to read content up to and including being able to manage permissions on the site. So you could go in there, you can pick and choose whichever types of options you want to be able to go ahead and incorporate into that permission level. Now, understand that this is only going to be available at the top level. It's not something that everybody's going to be able to do. But then once you create it from there, you can use it throughout the entire site, throughout the entire hierarchy that's going to be available to make sure you set that up. Okay. So if you want to be able to go ahead and do something like this, you can go into your SharePoint site, again, under that advanced permission link, you can simply click permission levels. And once you do that, it's going to show you the different permission levels that will show up. You can simply come down and click add a permission level, and it will give you the opportunity to go ahead and see all of that information there. Okay. All right. So very quickly to go ahead and summarize what I've talked about over the past hour. Okay. The first thing you're going to realize is the fact that you have the ability to go ahead and share files out. That's how people inside of the site are going to be able to get files from one place to another, from one person to another. You can do it in SharePoint, you can do it in Teams, you can do it in OneDrive. Okay. All the components that are associated with SharePoint automatically inherit their permissions from the level above it or from the level above that. And it makes it a lot easier that you don't have to go in and change a lot of different options to be able to see all of that. Okay. Additionally, and this is more or less of a best practice, if you want to be able, or if you need to break inheritance, it's a good idea to go ahead and do so at the highest possible level. Okay, now, does that mean that you automatically have to go in and create a brand new library every single time? No, but if you have, let's say you have one library, and in that library you have individual folders, you may not necessarily want to change the permissions on the library, but you want to have a folder that's only going to be restricted to certain people, and you want to have maybe a couple of documents that are only restricted to certain people. What you would do is take the documents, put them in the folder, then create the permissions on the folder. Ideally, you could create a brand new library and then create unique permissions on that library so that only certain people would be able to see the library and kind of go from there. Those are some options that you have as well. Okay. Again, like I said, don't necessarily just create document permissions. You want to make sure you create at either a folder level, better yet, even at the library level, because it's going to make it a lot easier to keep track of everything, to be able to see what's going on. Additionally, when you do something like this, make sure that you go ahead and use groups. Don't just simply add individuals. Make sure that you're going to be able to kind of keep track of everything that's going on. And also remember that users that are part of multiple groups, they're automatically going to have the least restrictive permission that's going to be associated with the site. So it's something to kind of keep in mind when you're going through there. Okay. Well, that is basically what I had for you today. What I'm going to go ahead and do now is go ahead and open it up. If you have any questions, by all means, feel free to go ahead and put them in chat or something along those lines. For everybody else, I'd like to thank everybody for coming in today. I hope you got something out of this other than a headache. Again, if you are interested in any of our classes, again, feel free to reach out. We'll be more than happy to get you signed up. But in the meantime, I wish you all the best of luck, and I hope to work with you again.